Informed, intelligent, in the black.
Yes, welcome, welcome, welcome. What's up? What's up? What is up? Back once again, it is the Incredible in the Black podcast. And in case you're not aware, this is a podcast dedicated to covering the current events and social issues going on in your black world and covering it all from the perspective of three grown ass men who like to get into a little bit of good trouble. I am your host, Big O, Mr. in the Black himself. I have a great conversation lined up for you guys tonight. But before we get into our guest and into that conversation, if you're checking this out on YouTube, because of course you're checking this out on YouTube, please make sure you finesse that thumbs up button. It's free. It goes a long way. Make sure you follow us across social media at In The Black PDCST on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, all of the places. And of course, if you really want to become part of the family, you can always come on over to our Patreon. We promise you, you will not regret it. Tonight, I have a very incredible guest, Dr. Terence Keel. Dr. Terence Keel is an award-winning scholar, the founding director of the Biocritical Studies Lab, and a professor of human biology, society, and African American studies at the illustrious UCLA. He has written the book Divine Variations: How Christian Thought Became Racial Science, and is the co-editor of Critical Approaches to Science and Religion. His latest book is The Coroner's Silence, Death Records, and the Hidden Victims of Police Violence. Please help me welcome Dr. Terence Keel. Dr. Keel, thank you, man. I appreciate you taking the time out. I know you've got a busy schedule, but I appreciate you for taking the time out to have this conversation with us tonight.
Thanks, Big O. Appreciate it.
Not a problem at all. Now, for our listeners, for our viewers, for those folks that may not be familiar with you, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. So I am a professor at UCLA. I teach and write about the history of racism, the history of medicine, the history of science. I'm very interested in how African American studies as a field really gives us insight into ways that our nation can get better, has gotten better, but also has more ground to go. I mean, if you study the history of Black life, you're really studying how Black people have fought for freedom and resistance in multiple different ways.
Indeed.
And from that lens, you can tell a great number of stories. And that's the kind of work that I do, trying to think through our society by thinking about the past and the present together.
Wonderful. Now, I'm going to keep it 100% transparent with you. I had your first book, Divine Variations, in my cart not even in my cart. I ended up purchasing it after getting recommendations for it after I picked up Jesus and John Wayne and some other books. So I thought that was interesting. So given that we were having this opportunity, I ended up pulling it to the forefront and started reading that too. So I've been diving deep into some Dr. Keel as of recently. So let's go ahead and start this conversation off. Your book, before we even jump into the book, let's start at ground level. You are the founding director of the Biocritical Studies Lab at UCLA. Please tell us a little bit about what that is and what you do there. What actually inspired you ultimately to create that?
Sure. Yeah. So I founded that lab in 2020 after the public death of George Floyd. And the idea of the lab is to pull together brilliant minds from around the campus and really around the country to think about how the societies that we live in, impact and shape our bodies, right? We often don't realize that we are human beings and we're vulnerable to the cities that we live in. We're vulnerable to police violence and pollution and to discrimination as a large number of things. And so what we do in this lab is we try to look at those intersections. And one project that has been our focus over the last 6 years has been our Coroners Report project. And what we are doing there is that we are gathering the names and autopsies of people who have died during arrests or who have died in jail here in the United States.
Okay. I'm going through the book and it had me going down a rabbit hole. And as of last calculated, it says there were 1,365 people that were killed by police in 2024. That breaks down to about a person being killed every 6.5 hours here in the United States by a police officer. Some people might see your book, especially without diving into it, some people might see the title of your book and the premise of your book and say, you're focusing on the wrong thing. We want to talk about the police that are doing the actual shooting, not the coroners in the background that we assume are doing the work of the police. So why did you want to take this angle, I guess, in terms of the study and break this down?
Well, it's because the coroner is the missing puzzle that we have not spent a lot of time thinking about. You know, I have, like many of us, been focused and understood how police are part of the problem. You know, they maim us, they over police us, they subject us to all forms of violence. But what I think the death of George Floyd also brought to our attention is the fact that when law enforcement kill our brothers and sisters and people who are in our communities, it's the medical examiner or the coroner whose job it's supposed to be to write a record that can tell us the truth. What happened? Who was responsible? And what does this mean? And what I was shocked to discover, meeting families here in Los Angeles and all throughout the country, families who have lost loved ones, brothers, sisters, daughters, neighbors, they've gotten a death record from a medical examiner or a coroner, and that record doesn't make sense. It doesn't make the obvious connection between the violence of police and how that violence appears on our bodies and contributed to someone's death. And really, George Floyd's death was sort of the eye-opening moment for me, because what we forget is that the controversy around George Floyd, two things set the world on fire. One was the video footage that Darnella Frazier posted on social media. The other was his autopsy. Because when the autopsy was published, the initial findings by the Hennepin County medical examiner, the medical examiner whose job it is to investigate when someone dies under mysterious or violent circumstances, every state has either a medical examiner or a coroner. Medical examiner has to be a doctor. Coroner doesn't have to be. We can get into the weeds about that a little bit later. In the case of George Floyd, the medical examiner said, oh, it was a homicide. But then when they explained the technical details of how he died, his autopsy said, quote, cardiopulmonary arrest complicating law enforcement subdual. What does that mean? It meant that while it was a homicide, really George Floyd had a bad heart. And his heart made it difficult for police to subdue him, so they had to subject him to more force. But ultimately, what set all of it into motion, according to the medical examiner, was George's bad heart. And that's just unacceptable as an explanation for what we all witnessed with our own eyes. And that is happening time and time again. It's happening on cases that are not high profile, that the media barely talks about, but that family and community members keep a long record of what's going on with the medical examiner.
Yeah. As you're bringing it to the forefront, right? I think it's a question that a lot of folks have, and especially in light of George Floyd, like you said, but even with more recent events. Can people, the public at large, actually trust the medical examiners and the coroner's offices, given the fact that they are part of the larger police apparatus that Black people, and I'll say marginalized people in a broader sense, never really had a good relationship with, and have never really been ones that have presented themselves as someone who can be trusted? And I'll give you an example. Recently, I know that there was an incident in Cobb County, Georgia. I think the young gentleman's name is Kyle Besenge, if I'm not mistaken, who was found hanging in the woods somewhere. And the coroner essentially said that it was a suicide. There was, and in conjunction, for lack of a better description, with the police department, said there was no sign of foul play and all those other things. And the community since then, as you can probably imagine, has been up in arms. So to bring it back, can people trust, should people trust these medical examiners and these coroners' offices when they're going through this process?
Oh, great question. I think in that particular case in Cobb County, if I'm not mistaken, video footage was revealed of of this young gentleman having an encounter with police a couple of days before. And so that's just worth noting. With any elected or appointed official in our democracy, trust is a very delicate thing that has to be maintained. And it has to be maintained by the officials that are in power. And if they do things to betray the public's trust, we should withdraw that trust. We should be suspicious. We should question and doubt medical examiners and coroners that show us time and time again they actually can't be trusted to tell us the truth or to write records that actually empower community to fight for justice. What I discovered investigating and looking at over 1,000 autopsies to write this book is that the medical examiner and coroner are very good at coming to conclusions about how someone died and classifying that death in a way that creates the lowest amount of liability for police and cops. And one of the ways that they do that is saying this person died because of natural causes. So not from homicide, not from an intentional use of force, not from negligence, but just because that person had a bad heart or had some other pre-existing condition, was suffering from mental illness or was a drug user. When these officials write records this way and blame us for our own deaths, I think that's grounds for us to say, we need to reel this system in. This system is supposed to be neutral. It's supposed to stand for the public, but you're writing records that provide cover for police and law enforcement. That's where the problem is. And I wrote this book to bring awareness to how this is happening in counties and cities and states all around the country.
Is there a way that we can hold these coroners and medical examiners accountable similarly to the way we try and hold the police accountable? Because once again, in preparation for our conversation, I went down a rabbit hole and I can't tell you the number of articles that I saw of coroners and medical examiners that either falsified records or did not add things and remove things and did all sorts of things. And people that have very few that I had seen that have been punished on the back end for the things that they had done. So is there a way, at least from your research, what you've been engaging in, is there a way that we can hold them accountable similarly to the way we try and hold police accountable?
I love that question because it really is one of the most important questions. And it's got a complicated answer because low-lying fruit, the way you hold medical examiners or coroners accountable is that you make sure every single medical examiner or coroner that operates in the United States is an elected position, which meaning they have to campaign, they have to go in front of a constituency, a voting group, and people can vote them in power and vote them out of power. Most counties and states, the medical examiner is appointed by someone else that we vote for. So here in Los Angeles, for example, the county board of supervisors, these are officials that run for office. They have the sole power to appoint who the medical examiner is, who is in charge of the 10 million residents within the county of Los Angeles. What that means is that that person can be in power indefinitely until the board chooses to remove them from power. So we need them to be elected officials, but here's where the rub happens. This democracy only works if we're paying attention and we're willing to roll up our sleeves. Because if you convert overnight every medical examiner into a position that they have to run for office, but we're not paying attention to the records that they're writing or even to the work that they're doing, and let's say forces and interests that are conservative are paying attention, then you might have a system where you're putting the same kinds of people back into power because people who have more progressive values or radical values who care about Black life and marginal people aren't going to the voting booth and aren't paying attention. And so part of it is us having to educate ourselves and get caught up with communities all throughout the country who have been dealing with these medical examiners that have been failing people and families.
You've said you've gone through over 1,000 plus of these through your research, and I can only imagine some of the things that you've seen or been able to find, because I know that my stomach was reeling just doing the little bit of research that I did. What would you say was one of the most egregious things that you've seen or come across in your research?
Boy, Big O, there's so many of these stories. When you look at how broken this system is, you carry these stories with you. They're not something you can just put down. And I actually think that's a good thing. I talk about in the book how writing this book changed me. A part of myself had to die. And I don't mean that to be hyperbolic. I mean that in a literal sense. I think I carried a distance between myself and this problem. Even though I've been racially profiled, I have family members that are impacted by police and law enforcement violence and have gone to jail. This is a system that I know really carefully. But it's another thing to look at the autopsy records when people die in police custody. It does something to you that I think, if you have a heart and conscience, it changes you. There are so many stories, but there are two that always kind of come to my mind. One is the story of John Horton III, a young 22-year-old man in Los Angeles who was in the middle of a health crisis. The family called for paramedics. Police show up. It's a very typical story. Rather than taking him to a hospital for care, they take him to jail and put him in solitary confinement. He's 22. He's sick. Why am I in jail and not in a hospital? What is going on?
Yeah.
Anyone who expresses that in jail gets seen as non-compliant, as a troublemaker, as someone who needs to be broken. And what they did is they put him into a wing of the jail where there are sheriff, deputy gangs. I don't mean gangs by civilians. I don't mean gangs by people in jail. I mean the sheriffs themselves have gangs.
Yeah.
Well-documented thing. Google
Yeah.
deputy gangs.
Yeah.
There's lots of investigative journalism on this. And they broke him. They subjected him to punishment and violence. And they told the family, oh, he committed suicide. He hung himself. And when his mother, Helen Jones, who have grown a really powerful partnership with, and she's been a huge part of all this work, when she got his broken body, she found all this violence that could not have happened to someone in solitary confinement who supposedly hung himself. The bridge of his nose was broken. There was abrasions on his face, recent blunt force trauma injuries in his back. There was a flesh wound around his wrist where he had been handcuffed, and he was struggling as the officers were beating him to death. And the medical examiner initially classified his death as a suicide. And it wasn't until she pushed back and started asking questions about the autopsy and trying to force him to make sense of the discrepancies of the record that he changed this to undetermined. Not everyone has a Helen Jones in their family or in their community. Not everyone has someone who's going to go to bat and educate themselves about the record and push local officials to do something about it. And so John's story for me was an entry point into this world of violence and death and indifference. And I think indifference is the key here, in that every day, 5 people die during arrests in the United States. Every day, 5 people. But we will only know the names of 3 of those people. And that's because we have a system that isn't really designed to track the names of the victims that it killed.
I'm glad you said that, because I do want to ask you about the reporting and investigating requirements. How does that vary from state to state? Is there a national reporting and investigating parameters, I should say, that these coroners and examiners have to follow?
There is. In 2000, Congress passed the Death in Custody Reporting Act. It was the first time in American history that Congress mandated law enforcement report the names of the people that they kill. I want to sit and think about what I just said. 2000, the year 2000 is the first time Congress decided to make this a mandate. So what that means is that there was no Congress mandated system tracking in custody deaths in 1968, in 1965 at the peak of the civil rights era, in 1915 at the peak of racial lynching in this country. In the 1990s, when we were reckoning with police violence in cities like Watts and
Rodney King.
What that means is that there are people who have been killed by police whose names we will never recover because Congress never required law enforcement to report those names. But the second part of what I'm saying also is worth just sitting with. We are asking the police to police themselves. We're asking police to tell on themselves about the names that they kill in their custody. And there is an inherent conflict of interest there. So while there are national guidelines, the reality of the Death in Custody Reporting Act, like its everyday practical reality, is much more messy. You got to trust the cops to report. And then even then, the mandate from Congress doesn't actually specify what needs to be reported and how it needs to be reported. So when we were trying to pull together all the names of the people who died in police custody, there were certain counties that would give us the case, but not the name. They would give us the name, but not the race. They would give us the race sometimes, but not the age. They would give us the manner of death, but not the name. So there was all of this discrepancy in the data where they could say, well, we're compliant, we're reporting, but what they were giving you wasn't valuable enough to make sense of what was going on, right? So yes, there are national guidelines, but they're weak. They don't have bite. They're not consistent, and they're ultimately not as useful as they could be. And so part of the problem needs to be, we need to provide a better system for tracking this, because it doesn't.
So how were you able to collect that information or to fill in the pieces? Did you need to file a FOIA, or how did that work? Because I mean, as someone whose background in sociology, I know that you have to be able to put the puzzle together. You need all of the pieces, right? Or be able to know the questions to ask and be able to grab that information, then paint a bigger picture.
Yeah.
So if you're going to be getting the age, but not the race, or whatever the case is, how did you fill in the gaps?
Yeah. Well, we use crowd-based sources, which are data sets put together either by nonprofits, investigative journalists, or independent civilians who are also tracking deaths in custody. And then we use those crowd-based sources and compared them with the government sources. And what we discovered is that a lot of the times, the civilian-led data sources were better. They were better because there were journalists who were on the ground in cities like Baltimore or Harris County, Texas, or Alameda County in NorCal, where Oakland is. And they were running the beat of police violence. They were on the scene. They were doing the reporting, and they could get information that sometimes wouldn't make its way into the federal level mandate reporting. And so what we had to do is we had to pull together all these different data sets and match them and provide a kind of comprehensive vision. And even there, we weren't under any delusion that we were going to get all the names, and that police continue to underreport, not properly classify, or rely on medical examiners to downplay cases of people dying in custody. So it required us to be creative and collaborative and to rely on people. And I think that's a thread of this story, this book. I don't write this book without the courage of Helen Jones and her ability to teach herself how to read an autopsy and then teach me and my student researchers. And I don't get the national picture. 32,103 people have died during arrests between 2000 and 2020. That's just arrests. I don't know that number unless I'm relying on public, crowd-based, independent sources. So this is a problem that I think the people are working towards. We just need more folks paying attention and being involved in the fight.
Understood. Now, from my ignorance, I should say, is you are very intentional when you use the terminology forensic medicine. Is there a difference between forensic medicine and forensic science? And
Great
if there is, please, if you can break that down.
Yeah, absolutely. So technically, forensic science covers the use of science and technology to investigate crime scenes, to do toxicology analysis, to take samples of human DNA at a scene, to analyze what might have gone on. So forensic scientists use the tools of science to discover usually crime scenes to help put together the piece of what happened. Forensic medicine can be considered underneath forensic science, but forensic physicians only look at the body. So they're interested in things like blunt force trauma, abrasions, bone breaks, the maybe existing conditions that the person might have had and how that may or may not have contributed to the death of the person. So forensic medicine studies the body. Forensic science studies the environment and the crime scene. And together, they work together to provide this sort of picture. And in most cases, coroners do the forensic science work because they're not doctors and physicians, although there are coroners who are police, which we can talk about. And medical examiners are licensed physicians who study the body, but they get the information from the forensic investigators who go to the crime scene to help them study what happened.
So how do you see forensic medicine playing its role now in, I guess, the larger picture of criminal justice as a whole? How do you see that playing?
I think it's failing us. I think that the medical examiners are not incentivized to do more than what they're currently doing because the public isn't paying attention. And when the public pays attention, they are forced to write records that make sense. And this all depends if you are living in a state where you can even get access to death records, because that's the other part of the puzzle. If a medical examiner is writing a death record or an autopsy in New York, you know what? No public citizen can get that record. The only people who can read an autopsy in the state of New York are next of kin or lawyers or someone from an insurance company. What that means is that when we were really trying to think through the deaths of people who had been over-policed during the age of Giuliani, or who were dying in custody during that time period, we couldn't get those autopsies because they're just not publicly available. In a state like California, you can get the autopsies, but the medical examiner can redact them. They can black out sections of the autopsy, or the police, the sheriff department, can put any autopsy record in California on security hold indefinitely, which means they remove it from the public record and they cite that it's an ongoing investigation and it would compromise their ability to get at the truth.
You can't be serious.
Yes. And so, again, this is why when I say we know five people die every day in police custody, but we only know the names of 3, a lot of these cases we found looking in California and looking specifically at LA, it's got the largest jail, it's got one of the largest police forces. There were names that just didn't appear in the record because law enforcement had pulled them out. We knew because of crowd-based sources that the number should be higher. So we were able to push. But without that extra information, we wouldn't have had leverage. And I think that's the terrifying part of the system. Like, there are levers that police can pull to circumvent democratic accountability and democratic disclosure. It's terrifying.
I have a larger question that I want to ask you, but I guess let me take a step back, because what you just said is really just it really hit me it really hit me very raw. I was going to ask you, do you see or have you seen that major cities in the United States do a better job of capturing and keeping this data than, let's say, more rural areas? But it seems as though, at least from what you've explained, that these major cities do a better job. They have so many incidences. They do a better job of navigating or circumventing accountability for the most part. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's right, because in major cities, you're having more people come into contact with police because the population is just bigger and the police force is also larger. So just the probability of interactions with cops are higher, rather than if you're in some rural county in Wyoming, for example. It has a small police force, it has a small population. I think Wyoming has something like 500,000 total residents. So the likelihood of violent police encounters in major cities there are more or less likely than in LA or Baltimore or Chicago. I think the other part of this as well, which is from our data, the most egregious cases are taking place in cities that have a large Black or Latino or poor working class population.
Of course.
Right. So it's on the one hand terrifying, but on the other hand, because those places where things are the worst are also places where there's the best opportunity to build up public knowledge and awareness and resistance to the system, right? So it's about organizing ourselves in these places, which is happening, to then put pressure on police and law enforcement and the medical examiner to be more accountable to people.
Would you say it's easier or more difficult? And I don't want to belabor the point, but I really do want to get clarity. Would you say it's easier or more difficult to get accountability in major cities like Los Angeles, Washington, or Baltimore because there are more people with more eyes, more access to these groups these third-party groups that may want to force the hand of the system to bring accountability? Would you say it's easier to get accountability in those situations?
God, I love that question. I mean, this is something we are grappling with our community right now here in Los Angeles. In theory, you would think that it would be because of all the things I listed. More people of color, more working class people, more contact with law enforcement. But what I don't think most of the public has really grappled with, and there are scholars who are writing about this, is that how much law enforcement has the media as an extension of its own propaganda or propaganda, as often it's called, which is to say, we as a public have been inundated with stories that tell us things like police are out for good, forensic examiners and medical examiners are truth-seeking people. You've seen the CSI stories. You've seen
Yeah.
And so what that does is it creates in a public this sense of, I know our criminal justice system isn't perfect, but there are bad guys out there in the world, and bad guys get what they deserve. And this sort of indifference to this system, I have encountered it over and over, even among our own people who will say things like, well, I don't know if I get behind prison abolition or defunding police, because what about the guys with the guns,
Yeah.
serial killers? And that type of perspective gets in the way of something more simple, which is, okay, fine, you may have that attitude, but can we just look at the conditions of jails right now? Because ACLU in Los Angeles called the Men's Central Jail a medieval dungeon. And we have got documented evidence that these conditions for policing and the way they deal with people in custody are inhumane. So let's confront that. And I don't think a lot of people are willing to do it. So I would say that the culture has to have a revolution in the way that it thinks about policing and law enforcement. And the only way you get there is you've got to look at the system for what it is. And you can't have this sort of rose tinted glasses that say police do the right thing. Medical examiners also have our back. I think more of us are aware of the fact that police are part of the problem, but that isn't enough. What needs to then, we have to evolve our sense of safety and crime and justice to understand, you know what, the people that have died in custody that I've written about and thought about, many of those people were just unhoused or underemployed or had mental illness or were suffering from drug abuse. They weren't violent offenders. They were people who just had been already failed by our government and
By the system at large. Yeah. When you brought up the abolitionist movement for police, and I think part of the dilemma that a lot of folks have, because here, at least on our show, we are proponents of at least the concept. I'm trying to be as gentle as possible because people get butthurt when you talk about abolishing police, or at least we're in the concept of abolishing the police. And we find that many people that don't lean that way is because they have a failure to reimagine what protection looks like without police. So I want to ask you, what does forensic medicine look like to you in this reimagining of things, if we're going to be doing it in a more revolutionary way?
I think forensic medicine that is progressive and revolutionary does not side with police and is actually antagonistic against police. And it does this sort of work of protecting the public from the overreach of government, from the overreach of law enforcement. That's what progressive forensic medicine should be and should look like. What we have now is not that. We have a system that is tilted towards police and law enforcement, or worse, it's tilted towards the elected officials that pay the bills of the medical examiner, and also the same elected officials that pay the financial settlements to families when they file lawsuits against the police. That's what we currently have. So can we reform the medical examiner system to be progressive and radical? I don't know. It's an open historical question that we're trying to negotiate right now. What I can tell you is that what I've been doing with communities around the country is creating our own system for reviewing the records of the medical examiner. And so what we do is we FOIA these records, we analyze them, and then we write reports, and we put those in the hands of organizations and elected officials and say, look at this crisis that's happening in your own backyard. What are you going to do about it? that has been more effective because there isn't a checks and balance system that currently exists right now. When they write the record, that's it. There's no more records. It's done. We as the people need to organize ourselves to really look at these things because they are part of the public record. They're part of what it means to be a part of a democracy.
How has the response been in that case, given especially if you believe that the approach should be more antagonistic? And I'm not saying that like in a violent way, but you get my drift. How has the response been so far?
It's been varied. I have spoken off the record to a good number of coroners and medical examiners who have said to me, whatever you think the system is, it's worse. I have been told by coroners who have said, I've worked in this facility or in this county for 30 years, and I have had sheriffs tell me nobody dies in this jail from homicide.
Jesus.
People die because they're sick, and we need you to write records that say this. And these are coroners and medical examiners in places where they're vulnerable, so they're not going to go on the record. I have had medical examiners who have been on the record saying to me, I'm glad you're writing this book because it empowers me to do more, because I don't feel like if I take the risk and go against the police, the people, the community is going to be behind me, because many people don't know what we're doing. And I have to work with police all the time. And one of my own failures is siding with police a little bit more than I should. So and then I've got medical examiners who have outright made it more difficult for us to work, who redact records now and who make it harder for us to get these documents, who actually block our efforts. We have to take them to court. We have to sue some of these medical examiners and coroners. And we've won those lawsuits, but they take time and money to do it. So it's been a range. It's been a spectrum. It's been really wow.
All right. I want to get you out on this last question, Doc. I'm going to presume from the way you've tackled this issue and in your writing the book that you have a more optimistic outlook on where forensic medicine can be and the overall outcome of where we ultimately can get to make sure that folks and families and the victims that deserve justice can get justice. The question I have for you is, how do you keep that optimism? Because like I told you before, I just from the small research that I've done, that rabbit hole that I fell through, it left me feeling some sort of way. And you've compounded it tonight. I'm just going to let you know off the top. You compounded it tonight. I don't know where I'm starting to feel like we're cooked, Doc. I don't know what to tell you. But reading is making me feel some sort of way. So I got to ask you, how do you keep that optimism?
Yeah. I think pessimism and optimism, or hope and nihilism, are just words that we use to describe how we feel about each other. It's just words that we use to evaluate our humanity. And I am able to stand in a space of hope and optimism because of the people that I've worked with, the people who have lost more than I could ever imagine. And they chose not to burn the system down. They chose not to be anarchists. They got out of bed, they mourned, they grieved, and then they organized. And they found other people who had similar tragedies happen to them. So I'm talking about the Helen Jones of the world.
Yeah.
I'm talking about women and families who have really learned, okay, this is a system that not just threatens my life and my family, but threatens all of us. And I want to do something to make a better system for the future. That's where I find the hope and optimism. It's this refusal to give up on democracy and to give up on each other and to say, no, this doesn't have to be this way. There is a better system that we deserve, and it requires us to do the work to get there. And so there is where I find the hope. And I also think, yes, humans are complex creatures. We are dark and we are also light. We are both those things. Yeah. I think when you step back and look at this country at a macro level, our federal government for several decades has been doing things to erode the social safety net. And that leaves all of us feeling unsafe, don't know if our jobs are going to last, don't know where those money's going to come to pay for groceries or medications or housing. All that stuff creates this frantic environment where we don't feel safe.
Yeah.
I think when we figure that out as a country, and whether it's at the local level, then I think people as a whole start feeling like their material needs are met. And when our needs are met materially, those brighter parts of ourselves, I think, come out and they shine. And I really believe that. And I see that there are communities fighting for this right now. We just need more people in the trenches with us. So that's where I get my hope.
Fantastic. Dr. Terence Keel, thank you so much. I appreciate you taking time out of your schedule, man, to have this conversation with us, man. Where can people find you if they'd like to find you, and what other projects do you have coming up along the way?
Sure. I'm on Instagram and TikTok. You can also find me at terencekeel.com, where you can get the link to buy the book. You can get the book anywhere where you buy books online, Amazon or Penguin or Beacon Press. And, the next thing that I'm working on is really trying to spread the word about the book and really start a new conversation about what safety and security will look like in the future. I think that we need to tackle that problem, because when we figure that out, I think communities will start feeling much more sort of grounded, and will live in the kind of society that we all deserve.
Fantastic. Thank you, sir. I am Big O. Thank you guys for joining us for another incredible episode of the In the Black podcast. You could have been anywhere else in the world, but you chose to kick with us, and we appreciate you for it. Please make sure you follow us across social media at In the Black, PDCST on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all of the places. And of course, like I said, if you really want to become part of the family, you can come on over to our Patreon. We promise you will not regret it. But as always, until next time, informed, intelligent, in the Black. Peace.